food is more than just, growing something and eating something, but it's growing in some place. It's moving to lots of places, and that's the global part. Sometimes ingredients come from very different places. And then who gets to eat what is a little bit of a global question as well, because the decisions made about how the land and water is used in one place will affect all the people around there and whether or not they're getting food that they used to get or whether they're importing something from somewhere else.
What is food security?
It's a really important and yet somewhat abstract concept, and much more commonly in conversation, people talk about hunger, and hunger is in the end the core part of it. But food security is about not going hungry. It's about whole communities and countries not going hungry. In some level, it's about the right to food that we recognize as humans, that's something we ought to care for and pay attention to. And it's also a crucial part of any state's political stability, what holds a country together. To be legitimate, a government has to ensure that people don't go hungry. And one of the ways that governments fall is because that fails for whatever reason. The system they had in place, the way in which people were getting their food, if that fails, then that will throw the whole legitimacy of a government into question. Another important thing about food security is it's been something we've been able to add important ideas to. So you first see the term being used by governments in the early 1970s. Big hunger at that time, famine is affecting Bangladesh, actually big food scarcities in what was the USSR. And the idea is really a fear that there's not enough supply for the population. It's a time where people are also very worried about population growth. And then over time, from the 70s into the 80s, you start to say, well, people go hungry even when there's plenty. And that's a reality we know in the richest country on earth in many ways, where the fact is people can't afford to buy what's available, or even if they can afford food, they can't also afford rent, can't also afford other things, education. And so they end up making choices where they cut back on their food, maybe skip a day, maybe skip 2 days if you're the mom, so that either the food goes further in the family or so that you can make something like a rent payment, big amount of money all at once, where the food is a little bit of money every day. And then into the 90s, we started to talk about nutrition. You need other things as well. You need sanitation. Otherwise, you're chronically ill. You're not going to get the benefit of your food. You need the food to be good quality. There's a lot of poor quality food out there. And so many people, women, for example, suffer from anemia. They might suffer from insufficient zinc or iodine. Iodine's critical to human health. And these trace elements seem so simple, but if they're not a part of your diet, then people suffer cognitively, people suffer from the just physical strength and well-being. And so we finally come into the 2000s, and really at the end of the 1990s, in fact, the UN definition of food security is access to sufficient, nutritious, and culturally appropriate food at all times. And there's this notion that it is not just now, but into the future, because people who have plenty of food on their table, but aren't sure that next month or next year that they will, they're also living in food insecurity. Their thinking is preoccupied by making sure that access will come. We've had availability, we've had access, then nutrition. The fourth ability is this, I would call it sustainability. It's often called stability, but that is about being able to afford it. We've seen how price inflation has caused a lot of disruption in people's lives, but also sustainable in terms of water, in terms of weather, in terms of not having climate disruption, conflict. Oftentimes within a country, local communities know who's hungry, and you'll find churches or local organizations, Rotary, they'll organize to make sure food's available. And we don't really have a space for those communities to talk about food even. So this area of really local governance, I think, is underdeveloped, and the food security is one of those places. It brings people together, it overcomes a lot of differences, and that money eventually, or that investment we want to make as a public, it needs a voice from there. Agency is a really important part of food security. People being able to decide and choose and to feel secure because they have a bit of control.
What factors are threatening global food security?
If we live in the US, we're not invaded by another country. We have a lot of money actually that we spend in the public budget on food security, but we don't do a great job in achieving things. And so we could do a lot better in making sure people eat well. But if you're in the Sahel, for example, the region of Africa that suffers from intense and frequent drought, you have a different set of issues. But the big global causes of hunger at the moment are climate change, disrupting weather patterns, both drought and floods, but also just severe weather events. And to say that's not just about whether or not the crop will grow or the livestock survive, but also whether you'll be able to ship the food. The Panama Canal has been in the news this last year or two because of inadequate water. Therefore, the ships aren't floating. Therefore, the canal is much reduced in its capacity. So you have climate change, you have conflict, probably the biggest proximate cause of hunger, always has been, and sadly, perhaps will be into the future. That conflict disrupts people, of course, by disrupting people's ability to plant, ability to move food around, ability to get food to regions. It's disrupting our global supply chains. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the economic sanctions put in place as in response, that has disrupted massive exports from two, big food exporting countries, both Russia and Ukraine. But you've also got conflict in places like Darfur, where that the hunger is much more intense in a lot of places where the conflict is civil rather than between two states. And then I think just more broadly than climate change, you have all of the things you might group loosely under biodiversity, or the fact that we're not allowing a lot of micro organisms to thrive in the soil, that we're not protecting our water systems and all of the services that water system, both freshwater and oceans, provide. These are all things that are also changing and in some ways undermining at least the way the food systems have been until now. They're changing very fast as a result of these pressures.
What role does the United States play in global food security?
The US has historically, when I say that, sort of late 19th century, much of the 20th century, it's been you could say, granary to the world. I wouldn't say it's fed the world exactly, but the amazing capacity for food production, the kind of land clearing that happened, and then the creation of big farms with a lot of technology, a lot of research that went into high yielding varieties, as they're called. The US did produce a lot of food, especially wheat, and some other crops, and it came to play quite an important role in a lot of countries globally as a huge wheat supplier, and then more corn and then soy. In today's world, a lot of what we grow here isn't food at all, I would say. It's feed, and then increasingly it's been biofuel feedstock. So it's been actually a food system that's moved away into producing more sort of agricultural commodities for industry and less food that people might eat every day and recognize as food on their table. It's gone into animals that we wouldn't be the number of animals without that feed, but there were animals that were grazing before, but now we've changed their diets. So there's a US role in international markets as a big supplier that has gradually been lessening as we grow other things instead. There's an important role. As a subcontinent, the US is able to grow a huge amount of food for itself, but we actually are a net food importer. That means we spend more on food imports than we earn from the export. That's a new thing for the United States. And we've come to increasingly depend on food imports, especially for these high value things, seafood, fruit and vegetables, things that demand a more involved food supply chain. There's more food safety hazards. They need more energy to keep them fresh. As we've changed our diets and started to eat more foods all the time, every day, less seasonally, we've seen a big increase in the value of the imports of the food that the US eats. And a third way in which the US government in particular plays a role is as a very large donor to the United Nations, as an important member of many UN bodies, as a very big donor through the USAID, its International Assistance Program. That means the US is also influential in terms of shaping how other countries invest in their food systems, in their trade systems related to food as well. So the US has been an important actor in that international conversation about what a good food security strategy might look like, because it's a big donor. It comes with resources to that conversation. The US is inclined to say we just need to increase production and free up the markets, and this will work. And from my point of view, living here, I think that could use a little bit of self-reflection on how well is that actually working for Americans? And would it work then for other countries if we're not satisfied? I'm not satisfied with what we achieve here. I would like to get that fixed before we take it abroad as a model.
What role does China play in global food security?
China stands out as a very populous country, obviously, that has had a firm and several thousand-year commitment to food security as a top-level public priority. China's approach to food security has shifted from around 2000, I would say, where it was always very intent on being entirely self-sufficient. It has become quite a big importer of food and also quite a big exporter of some foods. And it has maintained, I think, a deep commitment to national sufficiency, which for the rest of the world is probably a good thing, because it would import a lot of food otherwise, and it would have more purchasing power than a lot of developing countries would have. But that attitude, I think, is also useful or important in relation to these international or multilateral conversations, because China comes with an orientation and a commitment to food security being important. So, for example, as it invests in Africa as a continent, it's been an important investor there. There's a lot of discussion back and forth about the nature of those investments and the extent to which they're creating indebtedness. Of course, even our so-called aid creates a lot of debt as well. But I feel that the government comes with a very pragmatic but committed attitude to where food security lies in that order of priorities, and have been willing, for example, to say we're not going to export food out of the continent of Africa because that's not what should come to us. They've been extracting minerals and other things, but not food. I would say that it brings a slightly different attitude and a much more conscious commitment to food security as a priority.
How can the US and China shape the future of global food security?
Both these countries now hold a great deal of debt owed by other countries. And if there were a way, as has been pushed around climate change, but I feel even more urgently around food security, that was willing to look at just debt cancellation in exchange for investment in domestic food systems, I think that would be something that would cost little to these two major powers, and that would be a huge act of goodwill that, would be humanitarian, but would also let those countries move past hunger, move into other kinds of urgently needed economic investment. So I would make a plea to them as debt holders. And one of our challenges at the moment is that our international finance is disrupted by a rebalancing of power in which we're not yet clear how it'll come out, but it's not the post-war world anymore. And rightly, China, Brazil, other countries are taking a bigger role. But where that lands, it would be great if that landed in a place that was willing to treat certain human rights, like the right to food in particular, as something to uphold. So that aside, I think it's also a time, we just have elected a new administration in the US that is more aggressive about domestic development, America first, a kind of unwillingness to engage in foreign entanglements as they're seen. And from some points of view, that's disappointing to an organization like ours that is interested in international relations. But it does perhaps speak to a time where this argument about what we would call food sovereignty, that countries cannot be sovereign if they do not have control of their food system. That doesn't mean they have to do it all at home, but they need to afford what they're buying on the international market. They shouldn't be sort of going into debt in order to buy that food. That's not sovereign. Maybe there's some space for that argument to say the international system needs to make room for all to be able to do that investment in their domestic economy. I think China has never said otherwise. That's been its priority. It may be this US administration would respect some of that argument and approach, that this is about how countries make themselves strong and robust. And I would just say in a last thought that a lot of things that were bipartisan in the US in the past are stretched beyond possibility. Even agreement on a farm bill, which is how the US actually shapes both its food security interventions and its agriculture. But it's always been one of the issues on which it's been easier to find agreement than most. And maybe that's one of the areas where this Congress will make food security and food investment an interesting area for them to seek a way to move forward, where other issues are more ideologically vastly more separated.